Hello, it's me, Mr. Mack, and this will be our last lecture of your junior year in U.S. history. Sorry it has to be this way, and I wish I was talking to you face to face. I'm not going to go into much detail here. I just want to start talking about the coming of World War II. This is a topic that I could go on and on and on for hours. I'm actually tempted to make a podcast for the summer. If anyone at all was interested in that, let me know, and I might actually do that. Anyway, next year in modern world history, you should pick up right here. Okay? So, we've talked about the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt has done a lot to alleviate the economic crisis. The U.S. is not out of the Great Depression. It's a very troublesome time in the world. And it's not only the U.S. that's suffering this financial catastrophe, essentially the whole world is. And when there are major crises in the world, countries tend to respond in two different ways. In my opinion, and it is only an opinion, but it's one that I think most Americans agreed with, people who came through this era, the United States rises to the challenge. FDR's New Deal was filled with programs that were probably overdue, things that should have happened much earlier. After all, as I've tried to show, we've entered into a modern economy which is much more complicated than the economy of the yeoman farmer. And the U.S. government just hadn't been doing enough to make sure that everybody was benefiting from that economy, right? Remember, the preamble of the Constitution says that this government has been established for the general welfare. And the U.S. government hadn't been really considering the general welfare, and now it is. Other countries, namely Germany, are going to use this crisis, or I shouldn't say the country uses the crisis, but people in the country use that crisis to grab power and to use that power for terrible ends. Of course, I'm talking about Adolf Hitler. And we see around the world that there is a rise of totalitarian governments. By totalitarian, I mean governments in which one person or one party has all the power. And it's not just the regular power, it's that they have power over everything in society. Okay? So in the Soviet Union, we see the rise of Joseph Stalin. Stalin is going to kill about 20 million of his own people, just consolidating his own communist regime. Benito Mussolini in Italy, he's a fascist. He is going to consolidate power in Italy. Adolf Hitler, another fascist, the head of the Nazi party, obviously is going to control Germany, and he is going to kill millions of his own people, namely Jews and other minorities, homosexuals, communists, gypsies, people with handicaps. Hitler's gonna kill a lot. His main focus will be on Jews. Francisco Franco, another fascist, comes to power in Spain. Over in Japan, Japan is an interesting country because it's just recently become a modern country, largely at the prompting of the United States, and it is now controlled by its military. And its military has this kind of perverted code of the samurai, and it's going to use that code to try to dominate all of Asia. Okay. Now, the world in the late 1930s is looking like a scarier and scarier place. The U.S. retreats to its historic posture of isolation. Okay, most people in the U.S. thought World War I was a big mistake, or that the U.S. joining World War I was a mistake, and they don't want to make that mistake again. Congress has passed a super high new tariff called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Those tariffs are just going to make the Depression even worse. It seems like it's helping U.S. businesses because it's protecting those businesses from European products. But in the end, it's actually going to shut down trade, and it's not going to help the economy. When the war does finally break out, the U.S. is going to try to stay neutral. There's a whole movement. It's led by people like Charles Lindbergh, who's a very famous man in America. He's famous for being the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And they lead this movement called America First, which basically is saying, despite how terrible people like Adolf Hitler are, we should stay out of any European or foreign war. In fact, America First, it's not even clear that they think Hitler is a bad guy. FDR, think of him as like a child of Woodrow Wilson. He privately thinks that the U.S. needs to take a leadership role in the world because things are so terrible. But he knows that if he ever says that, he will not win re-election. So FDR is privately thinking about how the U.S. can enter the war, privately thinking about how he can strengthen the U.S. military, but publicly trying to downplay that. Okay? Again, it's clear to me that, maybe not clear to me, but I really, really fear and believe that we're living today in a world that's not unlike the 1930s, with a huge global crisis on our hand. And if you look at the political situation around the world, you see a lot of totalitarian leaders emerging, right? Vladimir Putin of Russia. Russia's a pretty weak country these days, yet Vladimir Putin is trying to amplify its strength. China really is a country that seems to me, making a move for greater global dominance. Is the U.S. going to rise to that challenge the way FDR rose to that challenge? I don't know. Let's talk about the stirrings of war in Asia and the Pacific. As I said, Japan is a recently modernized country. It has basically copied the Western world and created a very large, very powerful army and navy. But because Japan is an island with not a lot of natural resources, right? It's got a lot of fish, it's got a lot of bamboo, it doesn't have any coal, it doesn't have any steel. So it invades China for raw materials. And in that invasion, it commits horrendous atrocities. It's slaughtering hundreds of thousands of civilians in its invasion. I don't mean collateral damage. I don't mean civilians getting caught in the crossfire. I mean the Japanese army actually just executing people, often by chopping their heads off with swords. Okay, the U.S. sees these atrocities. It's actually pretty slow to react, but eventually the U.S. puts an embargo on all oil and steel sales to Japan. Now, remember, the U.S. is the largest steel producer in the world. It's also the largest oil producer in the world at this point. Japan really needs steel and oil for its army. And so this embargo is going to hurt the Japanese army, which is what the U.S. wants, because we want Japan to withdraw from China. Okay? So the Japanese army is in desperate need of oil and steel, as well as rubber, right? A mechanized army needs a lot of rubber. Where do you get rubber back then? We haven't figured out how to make synthetic rubber. Rubber comes from Southeast Asia. And Japan is thinking, maybe we should invade Southeast Asia. War in Europe. Hitler is trying to expand Germany. He says that part of the newly formed Czechoslovakia has a segment which has a large population of Germans, and those Germans should be part of Germany. So he demands that he be given an area of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. There's a conference in the German city of München, or Munich. Britain and France go there, and they very weakly and very lamely say, okay, Hitler, you can have the Sudetenland, but that's it. No more for you, young man. Any of you who have ever babysat know that when you say that to a child, okay, you can have one cookie, but you better stop asking, what will that child do? The child will just want more cookies. So Hitler gets the Sudetenland, and before you know it, he decides to take the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay? In the meantime, Hitler and Stalin sign a non-aggression pact. That's a treaty that says we will not go to war with each other. Now, the Allies, Britain and France, this is troubling because everyone thought that Hitler and Stalin would one day go to war with each other because the fascists and the communists hate each other. But now they've signed a non-aggression pact. After Hitler invades Czechoslovakia, he then invades the newly formed country of Poland. Poland was formed after World War I. That's September 1st, 1939. And that is the beginning of World War II in Europe. Britain and France declare war on Germany, and Germany promptly steamrolls France. Germany will invade France after a couple of months after the declaration of war, and France will fall to Germany in 1 month, leaving Great Britain to fight it out all by itself. Okay? In the Pacific, Japan, which I said is desperate for raw materials, decides to launch a sneak attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The idea is this. The Japanese believe that the U.S. Navy, which is very large, remember Teddy Roosevelt created a pretty large Navy, the U.S. Navy would never allow Japan to start seizing the raw materials from Southeast Asia, places like Burma and Malaysia, French Indochina. So the Japanese decide they'll sink the U.S. fleet in one stroke. Does that sound familiar? Have you ever heard of an entire fleet being sunk in one day? Oh, that's right. The U.S. did that to the Spanish at the beginning of the Spanish-American War. The Japanese were paying attention, and they're going to do the same thing. They assume that if they do that, the U.S., which after all is not a real militaristic country, will just kind of roll over and play dead. They're wrong about that. December 7th, 1941, the U.S. fleet is attacked. 8 battleships, I think it's 8 U.S. battleships, are destroyed. Fortunately, the 3 main U.S. aircraft carriers are not in port that day, and they survive. But obviously, the U.S. does not roll over and play dead. That isolation sentiment in the U.S. is gone. The next day, Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. In his speech, he says, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." Congress almost unanimously declares war. There were 2 people in Congress who voted against it. And the U.S. goes to war. Germany declares war on the U.S. the next day. They had an alliance with Japan, and we declare war on Germany, and World War II begins. That's as far as I'm going to go. It's a really, really dark moment in world history. You can't imagine just the destruction that's coming. But it's coming. Anyway, that's where we're going to end. I really wish that I could continue teaching this subject to you. I would love to teach you modern world history next year. It's not going to happen, but I would love to do it. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned some things. And please keep in touch. If you're interested in my podcast, let me know. Thank you.